I want to bring in Peter Vincent now. He's a former U.S. Department of Justice official assigned to the embassy in Colombia. Let me start there with an obvious question, then and now. I imagine when you were there, this would have been unthinkable. Talk to me about what it was like being in Colombia at that time and then this historic day.
Precisely, Mike. It was unthinkable. I did everything I possibly could, working with both President Uribe and then Secretary of Defense Santos, who was a very instrumental person in helping to fight against the FARC in the jungles, in the mountains, with laser-guided bombs, and then in the courtrooms in the United States and Colombia. And I never imagined, I never hoped that we would actually be able to find a day where we would have a peace agreement just a few days away.
And you and I talked about this months ago. I mean, there were so many steps along this process in Havana. And one of the things that you talked about was the referendum. And I want to get your thoughts on that because there's been so much bad blood, so much blood spilled over 5 decades. What's your sense about the public and how they feel about this vote?
You know, after 50+ years of killing and kidnapping and massacres, the Colombian people are so deeply hurt. Their national psyche is wounded. But I also think that they are tired of it. They want peace, finally. They want to be in a position to live their lives in a just and sustainable peace. And perhaps more importantly, they want their children to have such an opportunity. But the pain is so deep. We've seen the polls, we've seen them fluctuate back and forth between folks that are unwilling to forgive and certainly to forget, and those that are finally at the point where they're getting very close to being able to do just that.
And you and I know that this isn't something where you just flip a light switch on and off. There are lots of fits and starts along the way. We saw that in Havana. What are, as we watch the president himself speaking now live, what do you think were some of the defining moments along the way to get us to the day that we're looking at today?
I think President Uribe, now unfortunately, I believe, one of the greatest critics of the potential deal, deserves a great deal of credit for taking the fight to the FARC in the jungles and the mountains, for extraditing high-ranking members of the FARC to the United States, for seeking very lengthy criminal sentences for them. I also believe, frankly, that the Cubans deserve a great deal of credit for hosting and pushing these negotiations for just about 4 years, starting in November of 2012. Of course, Pope Francis deserves some credit for identifying this as a grave humanitarian crisis, and the United States deserves a bit of credit for at least playing a fair broker in this, in this deal.
And as we look at the live pictures coming from Cartagena, we see a lot of white. We see a lot of symbolism. I asked Toby about that. I want to get your thoughts. The fact that the lapel pin was taken off, put on these former bitter enemies, and then the pin itself being a former bullet. There's a lot of symbolism here today, isn't there?
Symbolism is incredibly important when it comes to national healing and collective forgiveness. And I think President Santos, who has been criticized, frankly, and his poll numbers have dropped significantly down to between 25% and 30% now, realizes that this is the beginning of the end, and there needs to be a great deal more healing, and that the real work now begins. Waging war is often very, very difficult, but keeping the peace can also be even more difficult and certainly complicated.
And speaking of complicated, taking out of the equation the FARC, there's still the ELN, and I thought maybe it was a hopeful sign, and I want to get your thoughts on this, that they have declared a ceasefire so that people can go and vote. What's your sense about reaching an agreement there? I know that Santos himself has said the kidnappings have to stop before negotiations can begin.
You're exactly right. Santos has said that, and I saw him just last week in New York City, and he made that same point. The ELN, which is a designated terrorist organization according to the United States government, has imposed a ceasefire, a unilateral ceasefire, but it only is going to extend through Sunday for the purposes of the referendum. The ELN only has between 1,500 and 2,000 armed fighters. They are going to be extraordinarily isolated. I think now the pressure will be very much on them to come to the negotiating table like the much larger, much more powerful, and much more influential FARC have.
And one final question. I know that you were there in the past when it was a troubled country. Your thoughts about returning to Colombia and how you see the future there?
No, I'm very hopeful for the future. Again, there's a lot of hard work. There's been so much blood spilled, and there are still so many victims. And I was never a victim, and it was not my war, but I did contribute in my small way to trying to help the Colombian people. I look forward to going back. This war has been a drag and a drain on the Colombian economy, and I look forward to an even more prosperous Colombia with an opportunity for everyone to live in a just and lengthy peace.
Hopeful, optimistic Peter Vincent, thanks so much for stopping by.